They said a man could buy almost anything in the Old West. A horse, a ranch, a reputation. But the one thing no amount of gold could ever purchase was another person's soul. The auction yard stood at the edge of Dry Creek, where every gust of wind carried dust, horse sweat, and the bitter smell of cheap whiskey. Wagons lined the crooked street. Cowboys leaned against hitching posts with half-empty bottles in their hands. Merchants laughed louder than necessary, pretending not to notice the frightened faces waiting behind the wooden platform. Nathan Cole arrived just as the church bell struck noon. His weathered bay horse stopped beside the crowd without a sound. Nathan climbed down slowly, dusted the trail from his faded coat, and adjusted the brim of his old brown hat. At 36, he looked older than his years. The frontier had carved fine lines around his gray eyes and left the quiet confidence of a man who had buried enough memories to stop counting them. He had not come to buy anyone. He had only come to sell 2 remaining steers before winter. Then he heard the auctioneer shout, "Bring out the Apache girl." The noisy crowd suddenly grew still. 2 armed guards led a young Apache woman onto the platform. Her wrists were bound, but her head remained high. Long black hair flowed over a worn buckskin dress stained by weeks of travel. Dust covered her moccasins, yet nothing could hide the dignity in her posture. Her amber eyes never searched for sympathy among the crowd. Instead, they looked beyond the town, toward distant blue mountains fading into the afternoon haze. Nathan felt his chest tighten, not because she was beautiful, because she refused to look broken. The auctioneer grinned as though presenting a prized horse. Strong, healthy, young, the finest Apache woman you'll ever find. Laughter spread through the square. One rancher nudged another. "She'll fetch a fortune." A heavy-set trader standing near the front smiled broadly. Elias Crowe. Nathan recognized the man immediately. Stories about Crowe traveled faster than cattle drives. Entire families disappeared after crossing his path. Travelers whispered about hidden camps where people were traded. Like livestock, no sheriff had ever managed to prove a single crime. Crowe lifted one hand. 500. Another bidder answered. 6. The numbers climbed higher. 700. 8. 9. Crowe never looked away from the young woman. He smiled with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Nathan glanced toward the small leather pouch hanging from his belt. Inside lay every dollar he owned after selling half his cattle the week before. Money meant seed for spring, repairs to the barn, another winter of survival. The auctioneer raised his hammer. $1,000. Crowe nodded calmly. 1,000. The crowd murmured in admiration. The sale was over. Then another voice cut through the silence. 1,200. Every head turned. Nathan stood motionless beneath the afternoon sun. Someone laughed. Another whispered, "He's lost his mind." Crowe narrowed his eyes. "You know what you're bidding on, cowboy?" Nathan met his gaze without anger. "I know exactly." Crowe studied him for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "There'll be another." He lowered his bidding paddle. The auctioneer struck the block. "Sold." The crack echoed across the town like a rifle shot. The guards unlocked the iron shackles from the young woman's wrists and pushed her toward Nathan. She stopped only a few feet away. For the first time, their eyes met. There was no gratitude in hers, only cold disbelief. Nathan accepted the folded bill of sale without unfolding it. He tucked the paper into his coat, then quietly picked up the reins of his horse. Without reaching for her arm, without giving a single order, he simply said, "My horse walks slow." Aiyana frowned. He looked toward the endless prairie stretching beyond the town. "If you choose to follow." His calm voice barely rose above the wind. "No one here will stop you." And with that, the lonely cowboy turned his horse toward the open frontier, leaving an entire town wondering why a man had just spent everything he owned, only to treat the woman he had bought as though she had never belonged to him at all. The town disappeared behind them one slow mile at a time. No one called after them. No one tried to stop them. Only the wind followed, carrying the fading echoes of laughter from the auction yard across the endless prairie. Nathan Cole rode ahead at an easy pace, never once looking over his shoulder to see whether Aiyana remained behind him. He kept one hand loosely around the reins while the other rested on his thigh. There was no rifle across his lap, no rope tied between the horses, nothing that suggested he feared she might escape. Aiyana noticed every detail. Years of captivity had taught her that trust was often another name for carelessness. She stayed several yards behind, far enough to disappear if the chance came, close enough to watch the man who had spent $1,200 without asking a single question. The prairie stretched in every direction beneath a pale autumn sky. Golden grass rolled like waves beneath the afternoon breeze, broken only by scattered cottonwood trees and distant rock formations standing like silent guardians of the frontier. After nearly an hour, Nathan guided his horse toward a narrow creek winding through the valley. Crystal water slipped gently over smooth stones. He climbed down from the saddle. Without speaking, he removed a small canvas bag from behind his saddle and placed it upon a flat rock. Inside were dried beef, fresh bread, and 2 red apples. He stepped back. "You should eat." Aiyana didn't move. "You first." Nathan nodded once. He broke a piece of bread, took a bite, drank directly from the creek with both hands instead of touching the second tin cup resting beside the food. Only then did he return to tightening his horse's saddle straps. He never watched her. That unsettled her more than if he had. Slowly, she approached the rock. The second apple remained untouched. She picked it up carefully. No poison, no trick, only fruit. When she finally bit into it, the sweetness caught her completely by surprise. It had been months since she had tasted anything that wasn't dry cornmeal or salted scraps. Nathan heard the quiet crunch behind him. He smiled almost invisibly. Nothing more. As they continued west, dark clouds gathered above the distant hills. The wind carried the scent of approaching rain. Nathan pointed toward a lonely ridge where smoke curled gently into the sky. "My ranch." Aiyana followed his hand. A weathered cabin stood alone among ancient oak trees. A small red barn leaned slightly after years of winter storms. Split-rail fences enclosed a handful of cattle grazing peacefully beneath the fading sun. No hired hands. No guards. No servants. "You live there alone?" she asked. "For 12 years. No family." Nathan's eyes remained on the trail. They're buried beneath the hill behind the house. Silence settled between them once again. This time it felt different. Not empty, just quiet. As they reached the front gate, Nathan climbed down and pushed it open. The hinges groaned softly. He led both horses into the yard before removing the saddles himself. Aiyana remained standing near the porch. She expected him to point toward a stable, a kitchen, a small room in the back. Instead, Nathan walked to the front door. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an old iron key, then placed it gently in her open hand. She stared at it. "What is this?" "The front door." She frowned. "I don't understand." Nathan looked at the weathered cabin. "It hasn't been locked in years." She searched his face for mockery. Found none. "What if I leave?" His answer came as calmly as the evening breeze. "Then I'll know it was your choice." He stepped inside without waiting for her. The front door remained wide open. The key rested in her trembling hand. She looked toward the endless prairie stretching behind her, then toward the quiet cabin before her. For the first time since the chains had been removed, Aiyana realized she was standing in a place where no one had told her what to do. And somehow, that freedom frightened her more than captivity ever had. Morning arrived without asking permission. The first light slipped through the cabin windows, stretching long golden lines across worn pine floors and the old stone fireplace. Outside, the prairie awakened slowly. Cattle lowed beyond the split-rail fence. A meadowlark sang from the cottonwood near the creek. Somewhere in the distance, an axe struck wood with a slow, steady rhythm. Aiyana opened her eyes. For a long moment, she did not move. The blanket Nathan had left beside the bed remained folded exactly as she had found it the night before. She had never used it. Instead, she had slept on the wooden floor with her back against the wall, where she could see both the front door and the window. Old habits refused to disappear after a single sunset. She stepped quietly outside. Nathan was already working. His faded shirt clung to his shoulders with sweat as he split firewood beside the barn. Each swing of the axe landed cleanly. Each piece of oak fell into neat stacks waiting for winter. He glanced toward her. Morning. Nothing more. No questions. No instructions. He returned to his work. Aiyana waited. Surely this was the moment. Every ranch she had ever seen followed the same order. Women prepared breakfast before sunrise. Servants cleaned. Slaves obeyed. Someone always gave commands. Nathan gave none. After another minute, he rested the axe against the chopping block. Coffee's on the stove. Then he walked toward the pasture carrying a bucket of grain. The horses came first, then the chickens, then the cattle. Only after every animal had been fed did Nathan return to the cabin for his own breakfast. Aiyana watched him from the porch without understanding. Kindness could be faked. Patience could be faked. But routine rarely lied. Late that morning, Nathan disappeared into the barn. When he returned, he carried a small bundle wrapped in brown cloth. He placed it gently on the kitchen table. For winter, she slowly unfolded the fabric. Inside rested a simple blue dress made from thick cotton, stitched by careful hands. There were no ribbons, no lace, no decorations meant to display beauty, only strong seams, practical pockets, warm material. She looked up. Why give me this? Nathan shrugged. The buckskin won't keep you warm once the snow comes. You expect me to stay? I expect nothing. He picked up his coffee cup. If you leave tomorrow, he nodded toward the folded dress. Take it with you. The words settled quietly between them. No promise, no demand, only choice. The afternoon passed beneath a cloudless sky. Nathan repaired broken fence posts while Aiyana wandered carefully around the ranch. She noticed old tools hanging neatly inside the barn. Saddles repaired more than once instead of replaced. Boots patched with fresh leather. Every object spoke of a man who wasted nothing. Near the back of the house stood a small hill shaded by 2 oak trees. Curiosity drew her closer. There she found 3 simple wooden crosses. No elaborate carvings. Only names. Thomas Cole, Mary Cole, and a much smaller cross. Samuel Cole. Fresh wildflowers rested beneath them. She heard quiet footsteps behind her. Nathan stopped several feet away. My parents. His voice was calm. My younger brother. Aiyana lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. So am I. Silence returned. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. As they walked back toward the cabin, Nathan reached into his coat. He removed the folded bill of sale from the auction. Aiyana's heartbeat quickened. Without saying a word, Nathan opened the fireplace. He held the paper over the flames. The edges blackened. The ink curled into smoke. Within seconds, the document that claimed ownership of her life became nothing but drifting ash. Nathan watched the last corner disappear into glowing embers. Then he quietly closed the fireplace door. I don't need a piece of paper. He looked toward Aiyana with the same calm expression he had carried since the auction. To remember the difference between saving a person and owning one. For the first time since they had met, Aiyana found herself unable to look away. Somewhere deep inside her guarded heart, the first crack appeared. People often think the hardest truth is the one hidden from them. Sometimes, the hardest truth is the one waiting quietly inside the next room. 3 days passed over the lonely ranch. 3 quiet mornings. 3 peaceful sunsets. And not once did Nathan Cole ask Aiyana to cook, clean, or work. He simply lived the way he always had. Before sunrise, he repaired broken fences. By noon, he checked the cattle grazing near the creek. Before evening, he chopped enough firewood to last another week. Every task was done without complaint, without witnesses, without expecting gratitude. Aiyana watched. Everything. She noticed how he always removed his hat before walking past the 3 wooden crosses behind the cabin. She noticed how he repaired old tools instead of buying new ones. She noticed that every meal began only after the horses had been fed. Little things. The kind that could never be performed for applause. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the western hills. The wind carried the smell of rain and distant cedar. Nathan saddled his horse. I've got to bring the south pasture cattle home. He looked toward the sky. Storm will be here before dark. Aiyana nodded silently. He reached for the rifle hanging beside the front door, then stopped. Instead, he walked to the kitchen table. A worn leather pouch rested there. He opened it. Inside were neat bundles of folded banknotes. Every dollar he still possessed. Without hesitation, he pushed the pouch across the table toward her. If I'm late. He hesitated only a moment. There's enough money here to buy supplies in town. She stared at him. You trust me? Nathan seemed surprised by the question. I trust myself. She frowned. I don't understand. If you decide to leave. He picked up his hat. Money shouldn't be the reason you stay. With that, he stepped outside. Moments later, the sound of hooves faded into the widening prairie. Aiyana remained standing beside the table. The leather pouch lay exactly where he had left it. Untouched. Hours passed. Thunder rolled across the valley. Rain finally arrived in heavy sheets that rattled against the cabin roof. Near sunset, the barn doors burst open. Nathan stumbled inside, soaked to the skin. One sleeve of his shirt was torn. Blood ran slowly down his forearm, where twisted barbed wire had ripped through flesh while rescuing a trapped calf. He barely noticed the wound. His first concern was the frightened animal shivering beneath the shelter. Only after drying the calf with old blankets did he glance at the blood covering his sleeve. It'll heal. He reached for a rag. Before he could touch it, Aiyana gently took the cloth from his hand. Without speaking, she cleaned the wound with warm water, then crushed dried sage leaves hanging beside the fireplace and pressed them carefully against the cut. Nathan watched the flames dancing across the hearth. My grandmother used the same medicine. Aiyana tied the bandage. So did mine. Silence settled comfortably between them. As she gathered his torn shirt from the floor, something slipped from its pocket. A folded receipt. She bent to pick it up. The faded paper carried the seal of Dry Creek Bank. Sale of 48 head of cattle. Her eyes widened. 48. She remembered the nearly empty pasture outside. Nathan quietly reached into another pocket. This time he unfolded a weathered newspaper clipping. Across the page stood a charcoal sketch of Elias Crowe beside a short notice announcing the upcoming auction. One sentence had been circled in dark pencil. Young Apache woman expected among final lots. Aiyana slowly looked up. Nathan did not try to hide the truth. I heard Crowe was coming 2 weeks before the auction. The fire crackled softly. I sold almost everything I owned. He smiled sadly. Not because I knew your name. His gray eyes met hers. Because I knew his. The room fell completely silent. Outside, rain washed the dust from the prairie. Inside, something even older began washing away. For the first time in many years, Aiyana understood that the highest price Nathan Cole had paid was never measured in dollars. It was measured in everything he had willingly chosen to lose, so that someone he had never met might still have a future. The frontier has a way of testing every promise. Sometimes with hunger, sometimes with winter, and sometimes with the kind of man who believes everything has a price. Nearly a week had passed since the storm. The prairie was green again, washed clean beneath endless autumn skies. Nathan's wounded arm healed a little more each morning, though he still hid the stiffness whenever he lifted heavy fence rails. Aiyana noticed. She noticed everything now. Before sunrise, she quietly carried water from the creek before Nathan reached the well. When she found a broken saddle strap, she repaired it with careful stitching learned from the women of her tribe. She even began leaving fresh coffee warming beside the stove before he returned from feeding the horses. Neither of them mentioned the changes. Some things grew stronger without needing words. Late one afternoon, while Nathan repaired a collapsed section of fence near the road, the distant sound of galloping horses drifted across the valley. Not one rider. Several. Nathan slowly straightened. Across the open prairie, 3 horses approached through a cloud of dust. Sheriff Owen Briggs rode in front. Beside him came Samuel Pierce, the richest cattle rancher in Dry Creek. The third rider wore an expensive black coat despite the warm weather. Attorney Harvey Denton. None of them looked pleased. The horses stopped outside the ranch gate. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat. Nathan. Nathan nodded politely. Owen. The sheriff glanced toward the cabin where Aiyana stood quietly on the porch. Town's been talking. Nathan smiled faintly. They usually do. Samuel Pierce leaned forward in his saddle. You embarrassed half the businessmen in this county. Nathan returned to hammering another fence nail. I didn't realize buying cattle and minding my own business required permission. You didn't buy cattle. Pierce's voice hardened. You bought trouble. Nathan drove the nail flush into the timber. Maybe trouble needed buying. Harvey Denton opened a leather folder. Elias Crowe sent legal notice. Nathan finally looked up. He wants his money back. The lawyer shook his head. No. He wants the woman. Silence settled over the ranch. A cool wind stirred the grass between them. Sheriff Briggs sighed. I've known Crowe for years. His eyes remained fixed on Nathan. When he decides something belongs to him, he doesn't stop. Nathan already understood. Pierce spoke again. Crowe made an offer. Nathan waited. $5,000. No answer. Cash. Nathan brushed sawdust from his hands. No. Pierce blinked. Did you hear me? I did. 5,000. Nathan looked calmly toward the pasture where his remaining cattle grazed beneath the afternoon sun. I've already spent what mattered. The rancher frowned. You could rebuild everything. Nathan's voice remained steady. What would I rebuild it with? Pierce looked confused. My hands. Nathan slowly shook his head. A man who sells another human being. He glanced toward Aiyana, standing silently beneath the porch roof. Loses the only thing these hands were ever meant to build. Even Harvey Denton lowered his eyes. No one answered. Sheriff Briggs placed his hat back on his head. I came to warn you. Nathan met his gaze. Crowe isn't sending lawyers anymore. The sheriff's expression grew grave. Next time, it'll be gunmen. The three riders turned their horses toward town. Before leaving, Briggs looked back one final time. Keep your rifle close. Nathan watched them disappear beyond the ridge until the dust settled completely. Only then did he return to the unfinished fence. Aiyana walked quietly across the yard. You'll lose your ranch because of me. Nathan picked up another fence rail. I almost lost it years ago. She looked at him. What saved it? He fitted the rail into place. My father told me land isn't what makes a home. He drove the final nail with one clean strike. It's the people you refuse to abandon. Aiyana lowered her eyes. For the first time in her life, no one had protected her because she was valuable. Nathan Cole protected her because he believed she was priceless. Far beyond the western hills, Elias Crowe sat beside a campfire surrounded by armed riders. He unfolded a map. One rough finger stopped over a single lonely ranch. Then he smiled. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we stop asking. There comes a moment when trust stops being a feeling. It becomes a choice. And once that choice is made, neither fear nor distance can easily break it. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Mist drifted above the creek while frost clung to the tops of the prairie grass. The first rays of sunlight touched the old ranch, turning every weathered fence post and every drop of dew into quiet gold. Nathan was already outside. He struggled to lift a heavy wagon wheel onto its axle, favoring the arm that still hadn't fully healed. Before he could try again, another pair of hands reached the wheel. Aiyana. Without speaking, she lifted with him. The wheel settled into place. Nathan smiled. Thank you. She wiped the dust from her hands. You would have done it alone. I've done most things alone. She looked across the empty ranch. I noticed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt heavy. It had become familiar. By midday, they worked side by side repairing the last section of the north fence. Nathan measured each rail with careful precision, while Aiyana secured the crossbeams using rawhide strips stronger than iron nails in the dry prairie wind. You've built fences before? Nathan asked. She shook her head. My grandfather taught me to build winter shelters. She pulled another knot tight. He always said. She paused. Anything worth protecting must first be built with patience. Nathan laughed softly. My father said nearly the same thing. She looked at him. Maybe wise men sound alike. It was the first joke she had made since arriving at the ranch. Nathan's smile lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the cabin. Nathan stepped inside, carrying a bucket of water. He stopped. The wooden table had been set for two. Stew simmered above the fire. Fresh biscuits rested beneath a cloth. Aiyana stood by the stove. I found your mother's recipe. She nodded toward an old notebook lying open beside the flour sack. I hope I didn't change it too much. Nathan looked at the faded handwriting. His mother's careful script. He hadn't opened that notebook in years. He sat quietly, tasted one spoonful, closed his eyes for a moment. It tastes. His voice almost disappeared. Like home. Aiyana lowered her gaze. I've never had one. Nathan looked at her across the table. You do now? The words escaped before either of them realized their weight. Neither tried to take them back. After supper, they carried empty buckets toward the well. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a sky filled with stars. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the hills. The peaceful evening lasted only a heartbeat longer. Then the horses reacted. Nathan's old bay gelding lifted its head sharply. Its ears pointed toward the western ridge. Another horse answered from the corral. Then another. Nathan stopped walking. What is it? Aiyana whispered. He listened. At first she heard nothing. Then, very far away, hoofbeats. Slow. Many of them. Too many for travelers. Nathan quietly handed her the water bucket. Go inside. She didn't move. So it's today. He nodded once. I think so. Instead of obeying, Aiyana walked past him. She entered the cabin. Moments later, she returned carrying Nathan's Winchester rifle. She placed it gently into his hands, then reached beneath the kitchen shelf and picked up the revolver he had once left for her protection. She checked the cylinder with practiced calm. Nathan watched silently. "You know how to use that?" "My father taught every daughter." She looked toward the dark horizon where the distant hoofbeats slowly grew louder. "I'm not running anymore." Nathan studied her face beneath the starlight. The fear was still there, but something stronger now stood beside it. "Choice." He nodded once. "Then we stand together." Far beyond the ridge, lanterns flickered one after another in the darkness. Elias Crowe rode at the front of 7 armed men. The lonely ranch was finally in sight, and before another sunrise, the frontier itself would decide what kind of men deserved to keep their names. The loudest battles on the frontier often begin in complete silence. No gunfire, no shouting, only the sound of men deciding what kind of souls they truly possess. The first hint of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when the riders reached Nathan Cole's ranch. 7 horses emerged from the morning mist. Elias Crowe rode in front. His black coat hung neatly over broad shoulders untouched by honest labor. The silver watch chain across his vest gleamed beneath the pale sunrise. A thin scar stretched from his ear to the corner of his mouth, twisting into something that almost resembled a smile. Behind him came 6 armed men. Winchester rifles rested across their saddles. Shotguns hung from leather scabbards. Every face carried the confidence of men who had spent years winning by fear instead of courage. Nathan stepped onto the porch. His Winchester remained lowered beside his leg. Aiyana stood quietly one step behind him. The revolver rested calmly in her hand. Neither of them spoke. Crowe guided his horse to the front gate. He looked around the ranch with open amusement. "So," his smile widened, "you've made yourself comfortable." Nathan answered quietly, "It's my home." Crowe's eyes drifted toward Aiyana. "No." He shook his head slowly. "She's my property." Aiyana's fingers tightened around the revolver. Nathan took one calm step forward. "She belongs to herself." The words floated through the cool morning air. Crowe laughed. Even his own men smiled. "You still believe that?" Nathan never blinked. "I do." Crowe reached into his saddlebag. He tossed a heavy leather pouch into the dirt. It landed with a dull thud. Gold coins spilled across the ground. $10,000. No answer. 12. Nathan remained still. 15. The prairie fell quiet. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Crowe spread his hands. "You'll never see this kind of money again." Nathan looked briefly at the scattered gold, then toward the weathered cabin behind him, the old barn, the repaired fences. Finally, toward Aiyana. "I already own everything I need." Crowe's smile vanished. "You stubborn fool." Nathan's voice stayed calm. "No, a free man." The insult struck harder than any bullet. Crowe's face darkened. Without warning, one of his hired riders urged his horse through the open gate. He leaned down, reaching for Aiyana's arm. She moved before his hand could touch her. One smooth step, one quick turn. His fingers closed around empty air. The rider lost his balance, sliding halfway from the saddle. Before he could recover, Aiyana pressed the barrel of her revolver against his chest. She did not pull the trigger. She didn't have to. The entire yard froze. 6 rifles lifted instantly. Nathan quietly raised his Winchester. Not toward Crowe, toward the empty space between them. One shot. That was all it would take. The morning seemed to stop. Wind whispered through dry grass. A crow circled high above the cottonwoods. No one breathed. Crowe slowly raised one hand. His men lowered their rifles. He studied Aiyana with cold eyes. "So," he smiled again, "you've chosen your side." Aiyana never looked away. "No." Her voice remained steady. "I chose it the day he gave me a key instead of another chain." Crowe's jaw tightened. He climbed back into his saddle. "This isn't finished." Nathan answered quietly. "It never needed to start." Crowe pulled hard on the reins. The 7 riders turned toward the western hills. But before disappearing beyond the ridge, he looked back one final time. "You've made enemies you can't imagine." Then they were gone. Silence slowly returned to the ranch. Nathan lowered his rifle. Aiyana exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. Then, from somewhere beyond the northern ridge, another sound echoed across the valley. Not 7 horses. Not 10. Many. Far too many to count. Nathan looked toward the distant hills. Along the ridgeline, Dozens of riders appeared one by one beneath the rising sun. Eagle feathers caught the golden light. Long spears reflected across the prairie like fire. At their head rode an elderly Apache chief wrapped in a weathered buffalo robe. He did not ride toward war. He rode toward judgment. And before another hour had passed, the entire frontier would learn why Nathan Cole had never truly stood alone. Justice does not always arrive with the sound of gunfire. Sometimes, it arrives in perfect silence. The Apache riders crossed the northern ridge like a river flowing across stone. One after another, then another. Dozens became scores. Scores became what looked like an endless line stretching beneath the pale morning sky. Every horse moved at the same measured pace. No warrior shouted. No weapon was raised. Only eagle feathers stirred gently in the wind. Nathan lowered his rifle. Aiyana stared toward the approaching riders, her heart pounding against her ribs. She recognized the man riding at the front, Chief White Elk, the oldest living elder of her band. His silver hair rested against a weathered buffalo robe, and the deep lines across his face spoke of decades spent leading his people through hardship rather than war. When the riders reached the ranch gate, every horse stopped at the exact same moment. Dust drifted slowly across the quiet yard. The world seemed to hold its breath. Chief White Elk climbed down. First, only after both of his boots touched the ground did every Apache warrior dismount behind him. Nathan removed his hat. The old chief studied him for several long moments. "You are Nathan Cole." "I am." "You spent everything you owned." Nathan nodded once. "I spent what could be replaced." The old man's eyes narrowed gently. "And what could not?" Nathan looked toward Aiyana. "I never intended to own that." The chief remained silent. Then he reached beneath his buffalo robe and withdrew a small leather pouch tied with faded red thread. Time had darkened the hide. The knot had been opened and closed countless times. Carefully, he placed the pouch into Aiyana's hands. She untied the cord. Inside rested a small turquoise pendant carved with the shape of an eagle. Her breath caught. "My grandmother's." The chief nodded. "She asked me to keep it until the day your heart no longer belonged to fear." Tears filled Aiyana's eyes. She had believed the pendant lost forever. The old chief turned back toward Nathan. Many winters ago, his voice carried quietly across the ranch. A young white boy crossed Frozen Wolf Pass during the Great Sickness. Nathan frowned. The memory slowly returned. Snow. A blizzard. His mother burning with fever. An Apache healer waiting beyond the mountains. "I was 14. You carried medicine through a storm that killed grown men." Nathan shook his head. "I only wanted to save my mother." The chief smiled gently. "Our healer carried enough medicine back to save 23 children." Nathan looked down. "I never knew." Good men rarely do. Silence settled once again. Wind moved softly through the prairie grass. Then the chief stepped closer. "Our scouts watched after the auction." Nathan looked surprised. "We wished to know whether the stories were true." He glanced toward the burned fireplace inside the cabin. "They saw you destroy the bill of sale." Toward the repaired ranch. "They saw you treat our daughter with honor." Toward Aiyana. "They saw her choose to remain." The old chief slowly raised one weathered hand. Without a single command, every Apache warrior lowered his head. Not in surrender, in respect. Chief White Elk spoke one final time. Today, his eyes met Nathan's. "You are no longer remembered as the man who bought an Apache woman." A long pause followed. "You will be remembered as the man who gave one back her freedom." Nathan stood speechless. Aiyana wiped away a quiet tear. At that very moment, a lone rider appeared on the western ridge. Sheriff Owen Briggs. He had come expecting bloodshed. Instead, he found an entire Apache nation honoring the very cowboy the town had mocked only days before. And somewhere far beyond the valley, Elias Crowe's scouts watched the scene unfold. They counted the warriors. They counted the rifles. Then they turned their horses around without firing a single shot. For the first time in years, fear had chosen a different master. The West never remembers the richest man for very long. But it never forgets the man who chose to do what was right when no one was watching. 3 mornings passed after Chief White Elk and his warriors rode away. The prairie slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The cattle grazed peacefully beneath the autumn sun. Fresh smoke drifted from Nathan's chimney each dawn. The repaired fences stood firm against the northern wind. Nothing about the lonely ranch looked extraordinary. Yet somehow, Everything had changed. Travelers passing through Dry Creek began telling a different story. Not about an Apache woman sold at auction. Not about the money Nathan Cole had spent. Instead, they spoke of the cowboy who had stood alone against greed without firing a single shot. Even Sheriff Owen Briggs noticed it. Men who had laughed during the auction now removed their hats whenever Nathan rode into town. Some looked ashamed. Others simply lowered their eyes. Respect had arrived quietly, just as it always does. One crisp morning, Nathan returned from the pasture carrying a bundle of fresh-cut cedar. He stopped outside the cabin. The front door stood open. Inside, sunlight poured across the wooden table where an old family Bible rested beside a small bottle of ink. Aiyana sat alone. Chief White Elk's turquoise pendant rested around her neck. She looked up and smiled. Not the uncertain smile of a survivor. The peaceful smile of a woman who had finally found a place where fear no longer greeted every sunrise. Nathan quietly set the cedar beside the wall. I didn't mean to interrupt. You aren't. She gently opened the Bible. The worn leather cover creaked softly. Its pages carried names written across 3 generations. Births, marriages, deaths. Simple records kept by people who had believed that love deserved remembering. Aiyana traced one weathered page with her fingertips. When I was a little girl. Her voice was almost lost beneath the crackling fire. My grandmother told me something. Nathan waited. She said no one chooses the name they're born with. She looked toward the window where the prairie stretched beneath endless blue sky. But everyone chooses the name they honor. Silence settled gently around them. Nathan never stepped closer. He never asked what she intended. Choice meant little if someone else expected the answer. Slowly, Aiyana dipped the pen into the bottle of ink. Her hand remained steady. She turned to the final page. Beneath the names of Thomas Cole, Mary Cole, and little Samuel, she carefully wrote, Aiyana Cole. The black ink glistened in the morning light. Nathan stared quietly at the page. His eyes grew moist, though no tears fell. You know, he finally whispered. I never asked you to do that. Aiyana closed the Bible with both hands. I know. She stood, walked toward him, then placed the old iron key into his palm. The same key he had given her the day they arrived. I don't need this anymore. Nathan looked confused. She smiled softly. Because this house stopped feeling like a place I could leave. She gently closed his fingers around the key. It became the place I chose to stay. Neither reached for the other. Neither needed to. The quiet between them carried more truth than promises ever could. Outside, a cool breeze swept across the prairie. The old cottonwood leaves danced through the yard before settling beside the 3 wooden crosses on the hill. Far beyond the ranch, Elias Crowe vanished into history. Some said he fled south. Others believed he disappeared into the mountains after learning an entire Apache nation now stood behind Nathan Cole. No one ever proved either story. It no longer mattered. The frontier had already passed its own judgment. Years later, travelers still stopped at the lonely ranch asking whether the old story had really happened. The oldest ranchers would simply smile toward the weathered cabin beneath the oak trees. Then they would say, a man can buy a horse. He can buy land. He can even buy another man's silence. But the day Nathan Cole spent everything he owned, they would pause, watching the sunrise spill across the endless prairie. He didn't buy a woman. He protected her freedom until she was finally able to choose it for herself. And in the American West, no name has ever carried greater honor than one shared by choice.